Thanks everyone for joining us. I think I'll give just like a second more for people that are being let into the meeting. But yeah, we're excited to have you here for this presentation, Just Accounting for Health and Wealth in Western North Carolina. All right, I will get us started here. So I want to kick us off by extending a thank you to the Dogwood Health Trust, which is the funder for this effort. Dogwood is a foundation based in Asheville, North Carolina, with the purpose of dramatically improving the health and well-being of all people and communities of 18 counties and the Qualla boundary in Western North Carolina. And they focus on innovative and equitable ways to address the many factors that contribute to health and wellness. So we're really appreciative that they have funded this program we're going to talk about today. I'll go through these guests in more detail, but the folks that are going to be speaking with us today include Dr. Ori Baber and Dr. Aubrey Rote. I'm Rachel Quidno, and then Rob Thomas may join us. He is another partner in this project. So I'll introduce Rob in case he's able to join us. He is a community activist and advocate at the Asheville Racial Justice Coalition, who has facilitated and been a keynote speaker in dozens of community-related events. So the Racial Justice Coalition is one of the partners on this project. Dr. Ori Baber is on the Urban 3 team, and he leverages his expertise in data science to identify scalable planning practices that produce better urban health and vibrant urban economies. So Urban 3 is another huge partner in this project. And then Dr. Aubrey Rote is the chair and associate professor in the Department of Health and Wellness at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. The Health and Wellness Department of the University of North Carolina, Asheville is the other big partner on this project. And then just to introduce myself briefly, I am the program director at Strong Towns. I also host one of our podcasts. And this conversation is mostly going to focus on hearing from Aubrey and Ori, but I'll let you know that the role of Strong Towns in this project is going to be primarily communications. So we'll be sharing regular articles that'll update you all on this project. We'll have a final report, webinars like this one in the future, maybe some podcasts. So we'll be the communications arm of this. And you can make sure to connect with everything we're doing by heading to justaccounting.org. Maxine, maybe you can throw a link to the chat for that. Justaccounting.org is going to be the hub for all of this research and everything we'll be sharing. You can also sign up for our email list on that site as well if you want to be alerted when we have updates. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And I will let you know right before we go into this panel discussion that you can submit questions as we're talking, and we will have space for Q&A at the end. So Maxine will flag those, and then we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. So Dr. Ori Baber, let's start with a conversation with you here. Would love to hear how this project came to be. I know that Urban 3 did some initial research that got this whole ball rolling. So how did this project come to be? Why the interest in tax issues?
Yeah, sure. Well, Rachel, thank you for the introduction. I appreciate it. I'll also extend, an appreciation to everybody that's tuning in today. I know that we've got some staff from our counties in this area, some elected officials joining us. So I appreciate you all taking the time to hop on and hear a little bit about this project. So Rachel, I've got a few slides that I'll hop on and share here in a minute that has a brief introduction to this program, but I would say there were a couple of things that coalesced around the same time that really motivated this particular program. Some of those came from Urban 3, some of the stuff that we were working on. Some of this was community-led that was happening here in Buncombe County and in the 18 counties of Western North Carolina. And then some of this existed more at a kind of a national level. There was a national conversation going on about kind of equity and property assessment. So here locally, speaking from an Urban 3 perspective, right, we're a firm that works across the US and internationally, specifically in the tax policy, property tax policy space. And I think over our kind of decade history working in communities across the US, we'd become more and more attuned to perhaps discrepancies or issues or challenges that local communities were facing within the property tax space. So I think we as an organization were already primed to kind of look at this through an equity lens. And then specifically in our local community, there were a couple of things that happened. One, so in 2021, our county engaged in a reassessment of all of the properties throughout Buncombe County. And shortly before this happened, our community, Buncombe County and the city of Asheville, both passed resolutions in favor of reparations for Black residents in our community, kind of signaling a commitment to advancing racial equity in our communities. Buncombe County declared racism as a public health crisis and began working very diligently on a racial equity strategic plan. So we've got that kind of legacy or lead in to this assessment process that started in 2021. Urban 3 decided to kind of take a look at this reassessment process from a race equity lens. We had the capacity internally to do this. We've got a team of very skilled data scientists and GIS specialists to kind of take a look at this, and observed some curiosities that emerged from this process that I think led us to do a little bit deeper of a dive, engage with some of our community members who were also working in the same space. And I think what that led us to do is basically say we've got some questions that need to be addressed here in our community. And we reached out to Dogwood and asked if they would be a partner in this effort. And we're grateful for their support to be able to pull our partners together and investigate these the performance of our tax assessment process here in these 18 counties. So I'd say that's kind of the arc here. One other thing which I'll mention in the presentation when I pull it up is there's a national study that happened from the University of Chicago that pointed to some issues of regressivity, some issues around that also provided kind of the backdrop for this work.
Excellent. Yeah, so if you want to take us through those slides and kind of provide some background on like what is this tax assessment issue, the curiosities, the questions we're pursuing.
Yep. Give me 1 second, I'll pull this up. Can you all see my screen? Yep, okay. So here's what I'll do. Actually, before I even jump into this, I do want to reference one of our previous labs that we've had here. So at the beginning of last year, May of last year, we did another webinar where we presented some of the initial findings from this work that I've mentioned here in Buncombe County. So I'd like to just kind of reference that, and I know Maxine might be able to drop a link to this particular lab. This is more of a local focus. We talk about a lot of those kind of issues that we identified. We had a guest speaker there. This was Larry Clark, who is the Director of Strategic Initiatives for the IAAO, the International Association of Assessing Officers. So I would just reference this if you guys want to see some of the initial work that we put together. But for right now, what I'll do is kind of zoom out and talk about this 18 county area that we're looking at, which is going to be the focus of this program over the next 18 months. So from Cherokee County to the west, Avery County to the northeast, Rutherford County to the southeast, and then Buncombe County, where most of our team is located here in Asheville, kind of right in the middle of this 18 county area. Diving right into it, right, getting right into the numbers like we like to do, looking at if we were to think of the total amount of real estate in these 18 county areas as kind of an indication of the net worth that exists within this 18 county study area. It's about $111 billion in taxable real estate value distributed across these counties. So just kind of pointing out some numbers. So Buncombe County, roughly $35 billion in total taxable real estate value, all the way down to some of our smaller counties like Graham County, Swain County, around $1 to $1.5 billion. And so this number, this kind of total taxable real estate value, provides the foundation from which property taxes emerge. And before I kind of talk about that, looking at where this source of taxable value exists from a land use perspective. So if you just look at the key down here on the bottom, I've highlighted residential land use in blue. So just a quick skim across these, we see that that residential land use holds a lot of that value for these 18 counties. So a large amount, almost 82% of that $111 billion is coming from residential property. And so what this kind of keys us into thinking about is, what is this property tax system? Where is this value coming from? Predominantly from residential land use, which is our residents, the people who live and work in this area. So then from that baseline total real estate value, we've got several taxing authorities. So our local governments, this could be county governments, this could be our cities and towns. We've got some special taxing districts, so a school board or a fire district, all then have the opportunity to levy property taxes against this total real estate value. And so what we're looking at here is the total amount of property taxes that are levied within each of these counties, including all of those different taxing authorities. All said and done, last year, there's about $965 million in property taxes produced in this 18 county area for all of those different local governments, ranging from, again, Buncombe County producing about 340 million to some of our smaller communities swinging at 7 million in total property tax generated, including all of those different taxing authorities. So we're looking at almost nearly $1 billion of property taxes being generated for our local governments annually in this space. Zooming back a little bit and just asking why we're even talking about property taxes to begin with, specifically in this space. So when we think of local government and the sources of revenue for local governments, I'll point you down to the key down here. I've highlighted in blue the amount of revenue that comes from property taxes as a proportion of the total amount of revenue for local governments. This is specifically for the 18 counties, so we're looking at county revenue here. Generally, what we see is property taxes are one of the largest, if not the largest, source of revenue for these local governments. Across the entire sample, it represents about 42% of the total revenue is coming from property taxes. So a fairly large portion of revenue that exists for local governments to engage in their work is coming from property taxes. So walking us kind of through that step in a little bit different of a configuration. So I mentioned that we've got roughly $111 billion in real estate value in these 18 counties. This provides kind of that foundation for property tax revenue. We've got multiple taxing authorities, local governments, counties, city, towns, fire districts, school boards that are levying taxes that in total for this area produce nearly $1 billion, so $966 million in property taxes. That then flow into public services. So our local governments are charged with specific responsibilities to help protect the welfare and well-being of our residents. That ranges from things like the justice and safety systems, our administration of local government, health services, education, so our schools, and maintaining the infrastructure within our community. So streets, sidewalks, parks, water and sewer, right? And so these programs, these responsibilities from our local government are in large part funded through property taxes. And I want to kind of pause here and mention that we're looking at this work through, or we will be through a health equity lens. And so one way that we might kind of think about this from a health equity perspective is really look at those programs and those services. And there's some really important questions that can be asked. We can ask, what does the budgeting process look like? Is enough funding being directed towards programs that improve the health and well-being in our community? So kind of a question about appropriation. So how do we take this $966 million and appropriate it, budget it towards programs, and are specific programs getting enough funding? So that's one kind of question. I'll give you an example here in a second. The other might be to ask, what's the efficacy of these programs? So how well the programs that are being funded through property taxes, how are they performing? Are they meeting the goals that our community has set forth, or not, right? So one example that I'll just kind of provide as a tangible case study that we can think about, our local community here in Buncombe County recently developed a homeowners assistance program, effectively a grant to help our residents offset some of the costs associated with home ownership in Buncombe County, appropriated several $100,000 to this program, $300,000 to $400,000 to $500,000. So, we might be able to ask that question, is this sufficient funding to meet the goals of this program? Perhaps is more funding needed in order to meet the goals? So this is kind of an appropriation budgeting question. All valuable, right? All valuable questions to ask, but this particular program is going to take kind of a step back, work our way back up this equation and ask that question of how are we arriving at this $111 billion of taxable value. And really the kind of question we're going to ask is if there's any sort of disparity that exists in how properties are assigned taxable value, and if there is a disparity, is this disparity being borne by low-income communities or communities of color within this 18-county area? And the reason we're asking that is because if the disparity exists at that level, it's going to continue forward all the way down into those various programs. So we're taking a couple steps back and making sure that the way this property tax is generated, starting with the assignment of total taxable value, reflects the objectives of our community, essentially. So couple more slides just to kind of round out this conversation. Why would we even begin to ask that question of whether or not disparities exist in the assignment of taxable value? I mentioned a national study that was recently conducted last year. This came out from the University of Chicago School for Municipal Finance, led by Dr. Christopher Berry. Maxine, if you want to drop a link to the New York Times article, I highly recommend that you all take a look if you haven't seen this. Skim it. A lot of interactive data platforms that I think are important kind of backdrop to this work, but I'll cover some of the highlights here. So essentially, kind of bottom line, what this national study demonstrated, I've pulled a couple of counties from our 18-county area that we're looking at. It demonstrates a trend in which lower valued homes, so we've got value across the bottom here, kind of home value brackets, and then their assessment ratios. And what this showed in multiple different counties here locally as well as nationally is that there's this trend that appears to overassess lower valued properties while simultaneously under assessing higher valued properties. So what this tends to do, if we were to follow that down the kind of property tax process, is this means that owners of lower valued properties end up perhaps paying more in property taxes than their fair share. So we look at this trend and we kind of see it emerge in a couple different counties in this study area that we're working on. Simultaneously, we look at other counties like Jackson County that exist, and we see more of an even line across the value spectrum. This is kind of what we would expect and hope to see. So I just want to call out what it might look like to have an equal assessment rate across all of these across the home value spectrum. So essentially what we'd like to see is a straight line here that regardless of your home value, you're being assessed at the same rate regardless of your home value. So that would be kind of the ideal situation here. This particular study looked at data from 2007 all the way up to 2016, demonstrated some trends, these trends existing at every year across this, time frame, which kind of points to maybe a historic pattern here that we're seeing. I will, caveat this that I've had the opportunity to speak with Buncombe County's assessor. We talked about kind of the methodologies of this study. He expressed some reservations about how the work was conducted, where the data came from. So I think it's important that as we move into this study, we kind of address some of those reservations. We do a very clean and transparent data process. So again, pointing at what ideally we'd like to see is this kind of flat line across all of these, not this indication of overassessment of lower valued properties, underassessment of higher valued properties. So real quick, this will be kind of my wrap up. This is, again, I want to point out, this is all coming from this study, this national study that was done, shows that across these 18 counties, our lower valued homes are assessed at a rate of about 1.4 1.5 times that of higher valued properties. And so again, translating that into kind of what that means for an individual resident homeowner here is that perhaps lower valued homes are realizing a little bit more of a financial burden because of this disparity we're observing in the assessment process. So our objectives are fairly straightforward here. One is to replicate the findings of this national study, update it so that the most current data, or the most current year that data or that study went up to was 2016. So we'll take it from 2016 to 2021, specifically drill down on our 18 counties in Western North Carolina, look for opportunities to perform or improve the performance of our assessment practice and our process. So that's when we'll really be reaching out to our assessors, asking, what sort of resources, what sort of capabilities, what sort of support might you need to address some of these disparities that we're seeing, and have those conversations with our local staff, all with the intention of really alleviating that burden on low-income communities of color. And then, widely on the tail end of this program, disseminate these findings throughout the 18-county area, develop a series of policy recommendations and some best practices. So with that, I'll wrap up and just kind of talk about our timeline real quick, right? So we're kicking this project off this month. We anticipate this being about an 18-month program in which we move through a couple different phases, predominantly collecting and analyzing data to begin with, the first half of this year, then really reaching out and doing some extensive community participation engagement around this work, and then developing that kind of toolkit, those list of best practices. So that's essentially the kind of timeline, the broad overview of this particular project.
Thanks so much, Ori. Very comprehensive. And I just also want to add that New York Times link is a fascinating study, and you can look at your own county in that in the interactive mapping in that article and see the inequities in your own place. So throughout this project, especially from Strong Towns perspective, we're going to be trying to really highlight the ways that this pattern of tax assessment inequities is also present in other spaces. So the Western North Carolina is definitely the focus of this research, but this is not just data that's about that place. Ori, a final question for you. What are your hopes for the outcomes of this project? What would be the ideal place that will land in 18 months or so?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question, Rachel. I have a lot of objectives, and I think this is coming from conversations that we've had with our communities and really what they're hoping to see us be able to pull off in this 18-month period. My ideal objectives would be to kind of clearly describe and understand the sources of discrepancies that exist in the assessment process, characterize them across all 18 counties, and then really be able to look towards solutions, identify whether or not there's specific things that could be done here at the local level, whether or not it's a policy intervention or practice, a modification to practice, and being able to kind of create that pool of knowledge and knowledge sharing among our 18 counties, such that we ultimately eliminate any sort of disparity that exists in the assessment process. That would be the kind of ultimate goal here. And I think it's not a too ambitious of a goal. I definitely think it will be able to identify some very strategic and practical opportunities to affect change.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Ori. We'll come back to you a little later for questions from our audience. Dr. Aubrey Rote, let's turn to some conversation with you. So you're based at the UNCA Health and Wellness Department. What do you see as the connection between these tax issues, economic well-being, and health issues and wellness?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I mean, this could be a long discussion, so I'll keep it relatively brief, but there's a very clear and strong link between the risk for chronic disease and higher financial burden and lower economic status. And this has been shown related to numerous factors. The list is giant, but Some big ones are obviously a massive increase in stress, which is related to all sorts of disease, the feasibility and accessibility of getting fresh, healthy foods, access to healthcare, the ability to pay for medical expenses. And again, I could go on and on, but there's so many factors that are related to this, and further burdening folks who may already be in a lower income status is definitely a problem.
And what do you see as like the unique stuff that your department is going to be bringing to this research and this project?
Sure. Just want to take a second to give a shout out to my colleagues who are also on this work. So we have a very strong interdisciplinary team we put together at UNC Asheville. We have Dr. Amina Batata, Dr. Fabrice Julian, and Dr. Sarah Donnelly. Dr. Julian and Dr. Batata are both experts in public health, whereas Dr. Donnelly and myself, I always hate calling myself an expert, but supposed expert area is more health sciences. So we've put together what I think is a really good team for this. And one of our first steps and goals in this project is to gather the literature around health disparities and the stress of a greater financial burden in order to just more fully tell the story of what these data really show us and the implications of them surrounding health. We're also in the earlier, and Ori obviously covered the timeline, but we're in the early stages of sorting out which health marker data we can get access to and what we can tie to the property tax data as well. That might include county health data, data from the CDC. We're discussing possibly some qualitative data. And then specific outcomes from the academic side would be, in addition to the larger report we're going to put out together in the community summits, we also plan to write up some publications for journals such as the American Journal of Public Health, and then also present at some national conferences such as the American Public Health Association National Conference, and possibly a few more. So we're really excited about all the potential here, and just really grateful that we were brought on board to work in this team.
Thank you. Yeah. Speaking specifically about this Western North Carolina region, what are some of the key health and wellness issues that you see that this project might have a particular ability to impact, or at least like uncover the issues?
Yeah, it's hard to say at this point. I mean, just like, and I saw in the chat, just like in many other states, there's obviously huge disparities in income, and then you can see the clear correlation with health outcomes. The list is massive, but I see, just from my own experience, just access to healthcare, ability to pay for medical expenses, especially given, where our health system is headed. Although I did just see that the owner of the Mavericks is putting out a prescription. I don't know, that was in the news today, but even prescription drugs are incredibly expensive. So that would be, if someone can pay fewer dollars in property taxes and be able to afford their medications, that would be fantastic. Obviously, we can't see the causal relationship with this research and these data, but definitely huge implications of what it could tell us.
Yeah, thank you. And speaking about health issues, there's also this racial inequity component to what we're talking about, racial and income inequities. Are there specific health challenges that you see for communities of color in Western North Carolina, or in your research that are connected to this work that we're doing?
They kind of run in line of what we've covered already. The same aspects as far as access to quality healthcare, ability to pay medical bills, access to, not just the ability to purchase, but also, is there even a food store nearby that sells fruits and vegetables? And on top of that, if you're paying higher property taxes, can you purchase those?
Got it. Well, thank you, Dr. Aubrey. We'll come back to you in a second. I just want to take a minute to talk a little bit about the role of the Racial Justice Coalition in this work too. Rob Thomas was not able to join us today, but he's the project lead on that. And the actual Racial Justice Coalition is going to be especially focusing on the connection to communities that are impacted by this, and helping lead some of the like community engagement efforts that we'll have. So I think Dr. Aubrey mentioned that we'll be having some local summits to discuss these issues with stakeholders and various different folks that are connected to this research and impacted by property tax inequities. And so that'll be definitely some of the work that the Racial Justice Coalition is participating in, and ensuring that we're doing good community outreach in all of our work. So I just wanted to highlight that part. Yeah, so we can start going into some questions, but I wanted to start with a question here that has come up a little bit in the chat and that I addressed briefly, but Ori, maybe you can speak to this further. The patterns that we're noticing in Buncombe County, and we're going to be exploring in the Western North Carolina region around tax inequities, are these, you know, just something that is cropping up in your region, or how pervasive do we think that this problem is, and what's the relevance for people who are listening and on this call that live in another area of the country?
Sure, absolutely. I think that's a fantastic question, and I thank whoever kind of brought that up. I would respond by saying we are, through this program, charged with taking a really in-depth look specifically to the 18 counties in Western North Carolina. So that is going to be our extreme focus is diving in deeply into the tax system and tax policy here in these 18 counties. We anticipate, and I've shared some of that national evidence that suggests that these patterns that we're seeing here locally are not isolated to our counties alone, and that this might be a kind of not nationwide, system-wide disparity that we're observing. And so I would just point to this study that Dr. Berry from University of Chicago did, and there is, like Rachel, like you said, there's an interactive platform where you can go into nearly every county in the U.S. and pull the same data. So if we've got folks that are tuning in from all over the place, I'd say hop on, take a look at that interactive dashboard, and you'll be able to see whether or not these trends exist to a certain extent in your community. I think what I would say is really what we're attempting to do is this study that was conducted by the University of Chicago was done so at the national level, which is a really great way to kind of pool a very large data set. And I think what we're intending to do is really take our focus down far more into asking questions of why and how these patterns emerge, and also ask what can we do if we see similar trends emerge? What are some opportunities to alleviate and undo perhaps some of these disparities that we're seeing? So I think that's going to be kind of the main distinction there.
Yeah. Another question to start us out here too. So the property tax assessment process is a pretty not transparent process that I think very few of us actually know what's going on, behind closed doors in a government office. And so we have these assessors in our communities. What do they actually like? What is going on there? And are we going to be trying to help them change their process, make it more transparent through this work? What do we need to know about how property tax assessments actually happen, and how much is subjective versus objective?
Sure. So I'll field that question as well. I'll caveat this with I'm not a property assessor, and that's not my training. I'm a data scientist that works in the planning and health space. So I almost take the data that's being produced by an assessor and use that to move forward in the work that we do. I will say that I've had the opportunity to speak with many assessors here locally, and I want to champion the work that they do and talk about the challenges that a local assessor's office experiences. And I think that's going to be part of the work that we do, is reaching out and having conversations with our assessors about their practices, their policies, and the challenges that they experience locally and getting their work done. Some of the things that I've immediately heard, I'll give some local examples that I'm familiar with. Right? We have over 300,000 individual parcels in our county alone. And so we've got an assessor's office that has a dozen plus or minus people in it that need to go out and assign value to these 300,000 parcels. So the workload alone is daunting. And so what an assessor's office does, again, kind of speaking on behalf of assessors that may be on this call or may be interested in this work, is they use a computer-assisted technology. It's called a CAMA model. Essentially, it's a software that helps assign values and do so in a way that is intended to reflect fairness and equity in that system. And so I think that'll be part of the task that we have, is to kind of interrogate that system, the CAMA model, and ask whether or not its performance is fair and equitable, and what some solutions might be to improve the performance of these systems. So I'd say, in regards to what do assessors do, they kind of provide the foundation or the backbone for the property tax assessment system. They're charged with assigning market value to properties throughout this 18 county area. So that $111 billion, right? It's their charge to get at that number and do so in a way that's accurate, fair, and equitable.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question here that I think draws out an important distinction. Rusty asked, how does the property tax assessment process compare to what I might see online with my Zestimate? That's like the Zillow estimate that you might see if you own a home. Is the goal to align this with market value? Yeah, so we're drawing out this distinction here between property tax assessment, assessed value from the government, and like actual market value of like purchasing a home. What is the difference there, and how is that important for this research?
Another great question, Rusty. Thank you for chiming in with that one. I've asked very similar questions, right? What is the role of something like Redfin or Zillow, and how is their algorithm perform better differently to local CAMA models, computer assisted mass appraisal models? Is there difference? Is one performing better than the other? This was a question I actually posed to the IAAO, the International Association of Assessing Officers, in a fairly informal conversation of like, are you all looking at Zillow as a potential source of data to fact check or benchmark locally? And the response that I got there, that I think deserves kind of more of a conversation and dialogue and research around, is that Zillow relies on data that's often produced locally. So they're absorbing data that's coming perhaps from the assessor, from sales data. So they're often working with the same data that assessors are working with. It's just a simple difference in how the algorithm kind of runs those numbers. So interesting, right? I think it would be worthwhile to kind of compare the performance of those two, but ultimately we're looking at the assessor as the kind of source of that definitive source of value for our local communities.
Got it. Aubrey, Dr. Aubrey, a question for you. This was mentioned briefly at the beginning, but last year, I know in Buncombe County, the commission approved this resolution declaring racism as a public health and safety crisis. How do you see, this work that we're doing with this project kind of trying to step forward into, acknowledging that resolution, and particularly like the health and safety implications of racial inequities?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think this project is great timing, and perhaps one of the main reasons we're so fortunate that it was funded. Data is powerful. You can say you think you see something all the time, which it sounds like many of us see this kind of in our own lives, but just don't understand it. But gathering data and telling the story, and then contextualizing those data with other research that's been done I don't see how those empowered to make change can say no to that. So, and I think it's accountable for this change that they've already said they're going to do, and presenting these data would be a really great timing, and a step that I think our city wants to make.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I know you mentioned like data is powerful, and I believe my understanding of like the origins of this initial question about what is this tax assessment inequity, noticing that it's even happening, comes from Joe Minicozy, Urban 3 principal, who like noticed that his own tax assessment was pretty off base with some of those of his neighbors, and like started digging into it. And here we are now trying to dig into it on a much larger scale. Let's see, I'm seeing a bunch of great questions here. Let's see, which one should we do next? From Kate, what do we know about the role of planning and zoning in the property tax assessment system? Is there a role? Ori, do you want to take that?
Sure. That's a great question, and I think one that we could spend some time unpacking. I would say at a legislative level, so kind of what assessors are charged with doing when they think about assigning value, it's to take into consideration zoning, land use for a particular property. So there's this kind of mandate that zoning should be factored into the appraisal process. And so I think one of the practical things that we're thinking about is how that's currently being done. What's the performance of the math model that's doing all of this? I don't want to get too far ahead of myself in this line of work, but I think the thing that we're going to be looking at closely is the way that properties are grouped together in a CAMA model is done so by using neighborhood codes, basically delineating specific areas within the community and comparing those groups of properties to themselves. The benefit of doing this is making sure that you've got a community of similar product, essentially. So if we're thinking specifically residential, single family residential, these neighborhood codes will group residential properties that share similar characteristics. So size, age, quality into a group. And what this effectively does is make sure that style of home, that neighborhood, that development isn't then being compared to perhaps a larger, newer development. So there's this way of kind of getting at geography, some zoning issues by grouping these homes together. I have no actual evidence to speak to this, but one of the questions that I will need to understand as we move through this project is whether or not that sort of grouping comes with some unanticipated consequences, right? From a geographical perspective, the idea of grouping and only comparing amongst each other, is that a sufficient way to handle this issue? And whether or not there are perhaps more sophisticated, kind of robust ways to capture both zoning, planning, land use, other than this kind of neighborhood grouping strategy. So yes, I think there's also a tremendous opportunity for, if we were to kind of zoom out from the math itself, for better dialogue and conversation and collaboration to happen between assessing offices and planning departments. So I think creating opportunities, kind of communication channels between those two disciplines is obviously a great outcome that could emerge.
Yeah, thank you.
We also have
Maxine. Yeah.
Hi there, I am the logistics coordinator for this Decoder webinar, and I saw that there was a great question from Andrew Jones that maybe Aubrey could answer. Dr. Rote, my apologies. Could the final findings from your work potentially be used as a model for other research work or assessment system evaluation nationwide?
That's a great question, and absolutely, that's the goal of any good research, is that we can replicate it in the same area and on a larger scale. So we'll definitely be, one of our responsibilities is to kind of guide the methodology of this. And when we do, we'll be thinking about how do we replicate this, because it is ideal that we can do this not only here, but a lot of you have been asking about other areas. So we want to be able to set out a path forward based on our work.
I'll also chime in there. So I think some of the outputs that our community can expect, and those of you that are tuning in from other locations from this particular work, is we will be making a deliberate intention to make this work transparent. And so the ways that we'll be doing that is we'll be creating a publicly accessible data hub. So all of the data that we will use from a land use and tax policy perspective, any of the data sources that we're working with, we'll put on this hub so that other folks have the opportunity to work with the same data that we're working with, look at how we've pulled, cleaned, curated our data. And we'll also, accompanying that sort of like data library here locally, is we will be creating fairly detailed methodologies, as Dr. Rote mentioned, on how we're actually doing the specific analysis, so that if another community wants to take our approach and look at our data and look at our approach and then replicate that themselves somewhere else, that sort of brain damage that we've gone through to develop that process is accessible to other communities that want to kind of pick this up themselves. So the other little like piece I'll toss in here is that national study that was done by the University of Chicago. I want to provide some kudos to their team, because what they did is something similar to the model that we'll take. Is they developed a GitHub account, and they've hosted all of their kind of analytical code that they developed in R, which is a data processing software, right? Getting kind of nerdy here, but they put that all public facing so that anybody can go and look at the methods that they use to do their study, which is, I think, an emerging best practice, right? To post your code and post the data that you worked with. So we'll be following suit and doing similar strategies there.
Yeah, and from Strong Towns perspective, we're also going to, throughout this project, keep trying to tie it into issues in other places, tax assessment inequities in other areas throughout the country as much as we can. We've had a couple of questions about land value tax and whether that is perhaps a solution to making the assessment process a little bit more equitable. I'm not a land value tax expert, but I do know that if this is a promising route that some places are exploring a little bit. Ori, do you have any thoughts on whether land value tax would be an approach? I think it's a little bit outside the scope of this project to try to propose a whole new approach to taxation, but
yeah,
is that a solution?
Rachel, I think I'm going to answer that exactly the way you have and say that I think this is perhaps something that as we move through the process of doing this work, that as we think about strategies to overcome or what opportunities might exist to deflect these disparities, I think if we start thinking about land value taxation, that may be something that we consider as a possible opportunity. I don't feel prepared quite yet to comment on that. I know Joe might be on this call. I know he might want to chime in at this moment if he feels so compelled, but I'd say it's something we'll think about, but it's just not quite part of where we are right here, right now.
Yeah, we don't have any preconceived notions on land value tax. And for anybody that this is a land value tax is a new comment or idea for them. Actually, Chuck did one of the best land value tax explanations I ever saw when he used to do his little classroom thing. So Strong Towns actually, deep in their vault, has a really solid explanation of land value taxation. In our experience, we've done work in Australia, and they have a level of that. For a lot of states, it would take some constitutional change to enact a land value tax. In North Carolina, however, by our current reading of the law, we could do something like that. The potential built opportunity in the land and its potential future income is actually part of our law. Now, it's just not been part of our practice for our state assessors to behave that way and look at it that way. So that's more of a whether or not it's going to be a legal change or a behavior practice change, we don't know. We're just going to go through the way that things are operating. We see the math and mapping is a form of using new tools to look at old practices and see how it works out from an equity standpoint. But obviously, we're at the start of this. There's going to be many more of these decoders on this as we go forward. So these are all great questions and comments. That's all I'll say. That's all I got. So I'm going to disappear.
Thanks,
again.
Joe. Thank you, Ori. I want to give a second before we do some closing notes and share resources for you all to keep plugged into this project. But I want to give a second if either of you have any closing thoughts to share after this conversation. Dr. Rote, do you have any final notes for this, at least preliminary conversation about this project?
No, not anything more than just expressing our excitement and our gratitude for the funding and to be paired with such great community organizations. It's going to be really exciting to work with all three of you.
Yeah, agreed. Ori, any closing notes here for our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would echo Aubrey here and just say, I'm encouraged to be able to work on this particular project. We've got a really great team built. I'm looking forward to working with UNCA. Rachel, I'm looking forward to working with Strong Towns. Rob and the Racial Justice Coalition, I'm looking forward to working with this whole team. Some kind of final thoughts that I'd offer to the audience, those that are tuning in right now. If we've got any staff or elected officials that are on this call from our local county or our local area, and you have questions or comments or anything that you'd like to kind of continue to talk about, please feel free to reach out at any point in time. More than likely, we'll be reaching out to you. You may have already received an email from Taylor on our team. We'll be doing some data asks, some data requests. So, this is my kind of maybe plea to help support that process. I know a lot of you have already provided data to us. So I just want to say thank you for already engaging and going there. So thank you to staff and local elected officials. If there are members of our community that have tuned in that want to get further plugged into this program, please feel free. If you represent an organization that would like to hear more from us, let us know. We'd be happy to come do a presentation, to come continue to have these conversations locally. And then for those of you that are tuning in from outside this particular study area, I think you all have a lot of opportunity to plug in and contribute to this work as well. So we're going to be looking for best practices and really innovative solutions. So if your community is tackling similar issues or pioneering some new solutions and you want to share those with us for us to think about, I'd like to open that as an opportunity for you to give us that feedback now so that we can start thinking about it as we move forward. And simultaneously, if your community is experiencing similar challenges or particular challenges, you want to share those with us to help kind of inform how we look at this work, I'd also extend that invitation and request. So with that, those are kind of my closing thoughts.
And for those that want to stay in the loop about this project and make sure you're alerted next time we have a webinar or a report to share, if you go to justaccounting.org, Maxine, maybe you can throw the link in again to the chat. That's the hub for this information. And there's a space to sign up for our email list to get alerted to things that are happening in the future with regards to this project. So let me close this out here. The few things that Maxine asked me to share. Next month's Decoder is on Missing Middle with Dan Paraluk. That takes place February 24th at 1 p.m. You can sign up on Urban 3's website. And then also a little Strong Towns plug. We have an event series kicking off next Thursday. It'll be every Thursday for the next couple months. And that's focused on a whole wide range of topics from zoning to housing issues, a whole bunch of different things with expert guests. We've got some staff from Urban 3 that's going to be participating in this, as well as Strong Towns staff and other folks in different fields. So encourage you to sign up for that, especially if you want to join. The first event is starting next week. You can do that at academy.strongtowns.org. And then Maxine, let me hand it off to you for this one.
Sure thing. I'd like to thank you all for attending our webinar today. And if you want to see the numbers in your community, please reach out to Kate Ryba, our Chief Operating Officer. And if you'd like to see or have Joe present at your community, please reach out to our Logistics Coordinator, Caitlin Nellis-Masters.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dr. Ori Baber and Dr. Aubrey Rote for leading this conversation. And we look forward to keeping in touch with all of you about this project as it develops over the next several months. So thanks, everyone.